Welcome, everybody, to the latest episode of Climate Voices. Today's episode is called Guilt by Trade Association, Calling Out Climate Hypocrisy. My name is Andrea Soccorso. I'm a volunteer advisor to ClimateVoice, host and MC for today, and co-founder at After We Vote, which is a pro-democracy, pro-civic engagement club to strengthen democracy, which includes not only voting, but also um, lobbying and getting active in between elections and what we do after we vote. And also an advisor to a Nobel laureate and child rights activist, Mr. Kailash Satyarthi from India. Climate Voice was founded by Bill Weihl here next to me on the stage, who headed up sustainability at Google and Facebook. Bill left the corporate world to push companies to step it up on climate policy and offset the lobbying power of big oil. Thousands of employees and advocates had signed the 1 in 5 petition urging companies to spend more on pro climate lobbying. You can check this out on their website, climatevoice.org, and the profiles of both Climate Voice and Bill Weihl here on Twitter. Climate Voices is a series of urgent conversations with people at the forefront of solving the climate crisis. Past episodes have featured leading thinkers and doers such as youth climate activist, climate scientist Katharine Hayhoe, award-winning innovator Saul Griffith, and renowned climatologist Michael Mann. We are all really looking forward to some inspiration for sure and much needed acceleration from today's episode. Guilt by Trade Association, a calling out climate hypocrisy, with Alberto Alemanno, founder and director of the Good Lobby, and our wonderful guest panelists who we'll introduce in just a bit. So tonight we will have an urgent conversation about a huge roadblock to climate policy progress, the pernicious impact of powerful trade associations, which we're seeing everywhere now. In the US, a historic effort to enact $555 billion in clean energy investments has been under unrelenting assault since last year by trade associations like the Chamber of Commerce. Even powerful pro-climate companies have only whispered their support for climate policy, while letting trade associations shout their opposition. Moreover, there is a well-financed network discouraging companies who want to take positive climate action. Now, in the final hour for this legislation, it's fitting to shine a light on the outsized role of these associations in blocking progress. And so, for those of you in the room who may not already know him, Alberto Alemanno is a founder and director of the Good Lobby, a civic startup, and also a professor of European Union law and policy at HEC Paris. Due to his commitment to bridge the gap between academic research and policy action, Alberto has pioneered innovative forms of academic and civic engagement and activism in the EU transnational space via his civic startup, the Good Lobby, as well as the EU Public Interest Clinic he established with New York University School of Law. He's the author of more than 20 scientific articles and several academic books. Alberto is a regular contributor to Le Monde, The Guardian, Bloomberg, Politico Europe, and Forbes, just to name a few, and his scholarly and public interest work has been featured in The Economist, The New York Times, The Financial Times, as well as Science and Nature. His latest book, Lobbying for Change, Find Your Voice to Create a Better Society, provides a timely analysis and guide to level the democratic playing field by empowering ordinary citizens to speak up and inform policy decisions at local, national, and international level. This is very exciting. Most recently, Alberto was honored with the Social Innovator of the Year 2022 award at the World Economic Forum, in addition to being nominated as a young global leader in 2015 and named among the 40 under 40 European young leaders by Friends of Europe. Benvenuto, Alberto. It's great that you're able to be with us today.
Grazie.
And
Thank you for having me.
It was very exciting, a kindred spirit and a very important voice. So I'm going to also just quickly welcome our other distinguished guest panelists coming to speak with us today on this topic. And we have Jérôme. How do you pronounce your last name, please, Jérôme? Is it Taguer?
It's Tajer, but I'll settle for
Taguer.
anything.
Thank you. So, Jérôme Taguer, the CEO of Preventable Surprises, Amy Meyer, who is the program manager for corporate climate advocacy at the World Resources Institute, and Ellie Georgeson, student volunteer with Change the Chamber's Congressional and corporate outreach team. She's a senior at Tulane University, majoring in political science and environmental studies. So we'll kick off this conversation with Alberto with a question from Bill, but I'm going to pass the mic over to Jennifer because Bill's having some issue with his voice, and Jennifer will take the conversation forward from here and ask a few questions on Bill's behalf. So Jennifer, over to you.
Thanks so much, Andre. And for those of you who don't know me, I direct campaigns at ClimateVoice, and we're very excited to continue this conversation at something that's so timely right now. And so let's dive right in. This question is from Bill Alberto, which is that, it's on a lot of people's minds. Is there such a thing as good lobbying? Or is undue corporate influence really the problem we should be trying to solve right now?
Thank you, Jennifer. Allow me to make a step back and to unpack this very loaded notion of lobbying. Lobbying is a legitimate, constitutionally protected activity that enables anyone to share information with policymakers in order to influence their decisions and their policies. So lobbying is first and foremost about participation. However, it has been hijacked by special interests and organizations that in reality, they only promote their bottom line. And therefore, they reduce the space for other voices to get into the process and inform decision makers. So time has really come to change our common understanding of lobbying, trying to demystify that into democratizing it. So to enable many more voices to be heard and to influence decision makers. I think this is the challenge. And once we get there, we're going to find out that good lobbying is not an oxymoron. It's something that can be reconciled, because if we make sure that there is an alignment between what people say and what decision makers are there to do and to push for, well, potentially lobbying might be enriching the policy process. But in order to do that, we need to pluralize decision making. And that's exactly what we're not doing enough. We rather witness the opposite scenario today.
Absolutely. So can you talk a little bit just then more specifically about what your team actually does to democratize lobbying? Like, how do we get there?
Well, to democratize lobbying is a pretty Herculean task, because as I try to say, we need to change the common understanding of lobbying and to turn it into something that might actually induce change. And we know that the literature suggests that if we change the rules of the game through policy and through lobbying, well, we're going to be able to trigger system change. So this is a bit of a paradox, right? On the one hand, lobbying is potentially what is going to save us, but today is what is really holding us back from progress. It's the reason why we don't manage to make any possible progress on major societal challenges, from social justice to climate action. I would say that to democratize lobbying, you can do two main things, right? You can work on the bottom up, and that's traditionally what my organization, my nonprofit, The Good Lobby, has been trying to do. So to enhance the advocacy capacity of the nonprofit sector, training and coaching thousands of organizations, matching them with pro bono advisors, and to professionalize the way in which they engage with policymakers. Obviously, this is very difficult to do at scale, but we keep doing it through a variety of offices and partnership all across regions. In parallel to that, we have also been working on lobbying reform, trying to push for greater transparency, but not only transparency on the lobbying side by asking companies to disclose what they do, but also imposing obligation on the other side of lobbying. This is the policymaker, the politicians, who should also be subject to greater disclosure duties in order to know who they meet and how that particular policy outcome has been achieved. This is the idea of legislative footprint. Third and last activity we try to engage in, and where we are actually seeing many more actors, including Preventable Surprises and many others, we really see the effort at making more responsible the corporate activity that is done by corporation. And here there's a lot of work to be done, because we need to move them away from the idea that lobbying is legitimate when you're pushing just for your self-interest, to a situation in which you are sharing access to policymakers. You are proactively justifying the reason why you are the attention of the policymakers. And this is exactly the kind of shift we need today. And this is part of what we might call corporate political responsibility, which might be the first step in order to make lobbying good for the many and not the few.
And when you talk to corporations, Alberto, what is the resistance to transparency? Because I feel like there's been a social consensus that we should be more transparent about the positions that companies take. And right now, even in the United States, though they have to disclose federal lobbying, companies don't have to say what side of an issue they're lobbying for or against.
That's correct. Today, we don't have a mechanism that allows us, citizens, but also investors and employees, to know how much and where a company is pushing for its own corporate political power. We just don't have this information, and lobbying regulation where they exist, like in the US or in some European countries, those regulations are very poor. They provide an aggregate data. We know that Google is spending a few $millions and euros to push for their bottom line vis-a-vis policymakers, but we don't know much about it, right? We don't know how they're using this money, on which policy files, on what kind of policy options are pushing for, to which trade associations do they belong, how much funding do they provide to think tanks. They are changing the entire informational ecosystem in which certain ideas and opinions are shaped, what kind of academic chairs they're paying and subsidizing across universities in the world. It's no mystery that approximately 70% of the literature on antitrust, meaning the literature that is really studying corporate power today, is somehow shaped directly by Google, just to mention one company who has been overinvesting in influencing decision makers through scholarship that is somehow serving the purpose of that particular company.
Yeah, no, that's an amazing point. So you recently spoke at the World Economic Forum. Congratulations. And in your speech, you highlighted this role of trade associations as an obstacle to enacting effective policies, particularly around climate. So can you talk about trade associations just to give our listeners a little context on what they are and how they lobby and why that's a problem?
Let me, first of all, to say that my so-called speech at the World Economic Forum lasted for around 90 seconds. That's what I was allowed to speak, which is already great, since I've been saying pretty uncomfortable truth to the many in the audience and those who were streaming online. What I've been trying to argue and to call attention on is the fact that today companies are trying to mitigate their negative impact by reducing their environmental and social footprint. But there is one particular impact they are not internalizing, and this is what I call the political footprint. This is what they basically leave behind through their lobbying. And most of this lobbying today is not necessarily done by the company themselves, but is done by trade associations that represent the particular sector or sectors in which that particular company exists and works. Obviously, this kind of lobbying today is even more hidden than the kind of corporate influence we were discussing before, because it's not the company exercising it, but it's other people who are actually paid to speak on behalf of a sector, of an industry, of a particular aggregate level of interest. And what we witness today is a phenomenon of apparent decoupling between what companies say, what companies do. They are becoming greener, they are becoming more social in their operation, but then their lobbying is doing exactly the opposite. So the very same company that appear to walk the talk on climate change by committing to reduce greenhouse emission might actually be lobbying against greater regulation of such emissions. Or a business might publicly support LGBT issues while at the same time funding a political candidate who is opposing gay rights. And this phenomenon today is potentially the major factor that underpins the lack of progress on critical issues, because it's totally hidden. It's something that we really struggle to find out about. And this is the reason why we're witnessing the emergence of a new industry of ESG ratings and other third-party entities that try to capture this decoupling in order to provide the full information to some investors who might be interested in actually getting the right perspective on how a particular company is positioning itself in the political landscape. And there is a demand, there's even a willingness to pay by those actors to gather this information that is clearly becoming relevant to the investors. It is probably becoming material per se to that particular company in a way which is pretty unprecedented.
Well, as you know, at Climate Voice, we have been working very hard to point out that corporate hypocrisy, particularly on the issue of climate. But I'm curious why you think we've allowed that amount of hypocrisy for so long, and how come no one is sort of calling trade associations to account. It's sort of, we've all accepted this as just the status quo, that you can belong to these groups that are undermining your public statements privately so that you can have it both ways.
I think for a long time, nobody dared to question the role companies play in society. They employ people, they create growth, and they should be entitled to get access to decision makers. And I think they still do. They still are entitled to do so because, as we said, lobbying is a legitimate activity, and provided what you're pushing for is not illegal, is not unconstitutional, well, you should be able to get access. However, we are seeing now the pernicious effect stemming from an uncontrolled access to the decision makers in a way which is basically highlighting two major, I would say, features. On the one hand, these companies have a near monopoly on knowledge and data that decision makers do need. So decision makers are very easy to capture. They need the voice and data of industries they are about to regulate. And on the other hand, we see that most of these policy processes are quite scarcely populated. We just have the few usual suspects showing up because we have an issue of resources and lack of professionalization for countervailing forces and actors to actually reduce the undue influence. So it is a pretty much of a situation of mutual convenience. Both the industry and the decision makers have a lot to win. It's go faster. You don't need to list everybody. You don't need to take into account all possible interests. And from a decision maker perspective, it is even much easier to meet a trade association that speaks on behalf of an entire sector, in particular if that sector is not very consolidated, is not very vertically integrated, and therefore it will be speaking with one voice. So at the end of the day, it's a very simple economic calculus and some convenience that explain why we have been accepting for so long that corporations could actually do lobbying through trade associations that are absolutely faceless in the eyes of the consumers and even investors today. And all of a sudden, this issue is becoming relevant, better late than ever, and is happening now.
So Bill has a question that he just sent me around sort of lobbying intensity. So one of the challenges that we see is that companies who want to be pro-climate sign joint letters, maybe go on a lobbying day on the Hill with some nonprofit groups in terms of advocating for a particular thing. And yet the opposition is using all of the bare-knuckled tactics, right? So they're going into your point earlier with disinformation, with funding research, with framing the debate in a much more intense way. And as Bill says, it's sort of like we are on our side is the paper airplanes and the obstructionists are rolling in with tanks. How do we level that playing field?
This is exactly the challenge we have today. Unless we level the playing field, we're not going to be able to address the major policy societal challenges we see today menacing on us. The repertoire of corporate political activity is immense. It is not possible to be replicated. And the only way to level the playing field is to change the rules of engagement. We can no longer assume that all interests have the same opportunities to get the ear of the decision maker, because this is simply not true. And in the US, obviously, the role of money are having even a further distortive effect in getting access to the decision makers. We need to start embracing policy reform. We should start thinking that the access to the decision making authority should actually be taxed, should actually be subject to certain forms of control. And we need to be creative about it, because all these kind of resources we're going to be gathering through attacks on participation, attacks on rulemaking consultation, could be used to actually redistributing resources to those actors who don't have the capacity, don't have the ability to actually convey their message in the same, let's say, effective way or manner as the industry has. We can go even further. We can even cap the lobbying resources that a company might invest. It might be capped as a percentage of its turnover, and this might also represent a benchmark. We all remember Senator Warren to put forward this idea during the Democratic primaries as a possible way forward. My claim has been for a lot of time that the license to operate of the company when it comes to their access to the policymaker will be questioned very soon. It might already be the case today. So unless the companies themselves will be taking some self-restraint in the way in which they approach the decision makers, they won't be able to maintain the level of access and influence on decision makers. It might take some time to reach that level, but this is certainly happening. So we need both voluntary action and mandatory action to create new social norms and political norms of engagement that today seem to be very far away from what we need.
And so, Alberto, you're based in Europe, and I'm just curious, are there any bright spots there? What can we in the US learn from lobbying reform that's happening? Are there differences between the two regions that you see?
No doubt there are differences. The European Union is not a federal state. We still rely on 27 different political systems. But over time, we have adopted, as European Union, thousands of regulations that define and shape our industries. And oftentimes they become the global standards, from the emission trading scheme to the pre-market approvals on consumer products, be chemicals, pesticides, that are basically becoming the standard setting. And we see something happening also on sustainability packages and regulation when it comes to non-financial reporting and other aspects. Having said so, the European Union is a system which is considerably less political and politicized than the US, and this is make it much more technocratic, which is on the one hand a good news, but is also a bad news because it's even more insulated from a public interest lobbying and advocacy because it's just too technical and too difficult to create added value if you're a non-profit to get into the system. The quality of the regulatory framework when it comes to transparency and accountability is pretty equivalent to the American one, with a major exception. Political spending is much more controlled. As Steve Bannon has been joking a few months ago, it only costs 4 million euros to actually make Brexit happen, right? So we are a cheap system because there are so many checks and balances on political donation. But when it comes to lobbying per se, we also have mandatory disclosure. But as I was saying, in a way, lobbying is just the tip of an iceberg. Also in Europe, we see, like in the US, many more corporate political activities taking place, which are much more insidious, just meeting the decision makers. And all these alternative forms of lobbying remain, I would say, uncovered by the regulation. So there's been a lot of abuses, in particular by the big tech companies, which have unlimited amount to be spent in lobbying to capture entirely the regulatory process at the European level, to slow it down. And you saw how difficult it has been for the European Union to adopt a pretty ambitious anti-big tech package that basically wanted to make more responsible the way in which data are extracted, they're used. And this really is something that showed the outer limits of the European system of regulation of lobbying and other forms of influence. It is absolutely unfit for purpose today.
Well, to that point, on your website, you explicitly sort of say that many people, particularly young people, feel powerless. They're disengaged from the policy process because of this level of capture and sort of hypocrisy. What do you feel like are the most important steps that individuals can take to become more engaged and to try to drive change?
Well, I think awareness that we are not only consumers, we are also citizens. We are oftentimes employees, we are investors all at the same time. So these are all multiple levers of change that probably we don't use enough. We are simply not aware and we don't feel literate enough to engage with government. But today we witness a sort of paradox because on the one hand, we see that electoral democracy is going down. There's less people showing up. We just saw this in France in the recent election where the majority of French didn't show up. And on the other hand, we see that the desire for participation in the space between elections, this is exactly where lobbying take place, is actually going up. So in a way, we are failing to capture this demand for participation and this demand that many citizens as employees, as investors, as citizens really want to contribute to the political process. The methodology we develop at the Good Lobby and that we are really trying to evangelize as much as we can is a 10-step process that allow virtually anyone to pick up a battle, to do his homework, her homework, and to devise an advocacy strategy that will identify like-minded individual and organization and identifying the most conducive ways to actually influence decision makers by holding them accountable to their promises. We see these mechanisms at play at the European level, and we also see that when individuals and organizations do borrow from the repertoire of tools used by professional lobbyists, they really succeed. They really manage to get the attention of the decision makers. We saw in an incredible and counterintuitive fashion the European Union adopting a major whistleblowing protection legislation back in 2015-16 in the aftermath of Edward Snowden, when in the US there was still, a major debate on whether whistleblowers should be celebrated or whether they should be prosecuted. Well, the European Union decided to protect them as a result of a major grassroots movement that was driven by citizens. We see something happening now around human rights due diligence, around sustainability issues. We see a major attempt by citizens, grassroots organization to team up with some progressive companies, big corporations that are trying to enter into the political space in order to build these kind of good lobbies that also try to serve the interest of the decision makers. To go back to my point, a politician likes to meet a group of people which is quite representative of different interests, basically asking for the same policy option. And this is exactly the kind of approach I think we should strategically and tactically share and promote more often.
Absolutely. And as you know, at ClimateVoice, we're particularly focused on galvanizing employees as agents of change. So in addition to being citizens, those of us who work for big companies can influence the lobbying of those organizations. So what advice do you have to employees in particular in terms of how they should, first of all, do some of that due diligence to know where their companies stand on some of these important issues? And then how can they make change from within?
Let me first say that I'm a big fan of ClimateVoice and the work you're doing, that I think has a lot of untapped potential also in other regions of the world, including in Europe. This is at least the lesson that we have learned over the last few months, where the Good Lobby had, for the first time, a direct exposure to the power of employees' mobilization. On February 24th, on the very first day of the Russian invasion, the Good Lobby, together with Progressive Shopper, decided to set up an Ukrainian corporate index, which was tracking live the corporate response or lack of response to the Russian invasion to Ukraine. We have been checking and trying to see what companies were saying, what companies were doing, and whether they were positioning themselves. And what we realized after drawing quickly this index that captured approximately 100 companies in the first 2 weeks, and then it grew up to 400, was the incredible reaction, not only of very angry public relations and lobbyist agencies from around the world working for those companies we put under a red label because they were basically silent and not taking any position, was the response by a incredible and unprecedented number of employees writing to us by, first of all, denouncing their own brands, their own companies, their own employers for not taking a stance because many of them were B2B companies, therefore their brands were not necessarily visible, so they didn't feel exposed, but also employees denouncing the fact, the double game that many companies were actually playing. Some companies were actually announcing to suspend shipments or even to close the shops. And it turned out that several activists in St. Petersburg or in Moscow, through Instagram, they were showing us that these shops were actually still open, still operating, and their stocks would have allowed them to remain open for months. So we still have companies today that declare to close or to stop their shipments, but they're still operating in Russia today. I think the employees, they played a crucial role in feeding this information, and they clearly told us that they are a force for good by clearly not tolerating any longer the double speaking of their employers, and to be quite vocal and even not hiding themselves. Most of these emails we have been receiving, they had a first name, a family name, they had an affiliation, They were using, in some instances, even the corporate email address, which was a bit counterintuitive for us. So they were extremely convinced to be on the right side of history. So what an incredible lesson I think we can draw from this experience in order to scale even further the work you're doing at ClimateVoice.
It's a wonderful example. And I do think it also underscores the importance of scorecards and having a simple way to show that kind of corporate hypocrisy so that employees can then take that information and run with it, which is what we've been trying to do with many of our work as well. So with that, I just want to turn it back to Andrea to invite our panelists to join this conversation as we keep going.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Alberto. I do have one quick question for Alberto, who I know has to jump off a bit early today, which is, first of all, I want to thank you for your work and say that obviously many of us wholeheartedly agree with you. Looking at the US with the political gridlock we currently have on a number of issues in the current climate, I wonder if there are any specific thoughts or rays of hope or suggestions that you can ask those of us here. You know, many people want to look at getting money out of politics and giving citizens a fair chance. Are there any additional success models you can point us to?
Well, I'm quite hopeful that the sustainability movement we see at play will continue to build the most advanced accountability system for corporate power ever existed. If you think about it, what we see now being done by ESG ratings, sustainability frameworks, is to make visible what is not visible, what is not yet visible, because our lobbying regulations are simply not capable of capturing that truth, right? Think about trade association activity. So if we continue witnessing the emergence of this accountability ecosystem on corporate power, it will be somehow inevitable that companies will be reassessing their political engagement by limiting, reducing, reconsidering their engagement with some trade association, as we see happening up to a point, perhaps even giving up certain forms of engagement, exercising self-restraints, and finally realizing that they cannot thrive unless they protect the critical democratic infrastructure, which is basically represented by the media sphere, by the political parties, by the public administration. In other words, they can no longer free ride on our democratic system. They need to return what they've been using for decades without necessarily investing. So for reforms like, civic time off, allowing your employees to have free time in order to engage not only on voting day, but also with nonprofit organization through skill sharing, will be something that could be easily done at the very bottom up. And on the top down, we can see different kind of ideas, as I was saying, participation fees, consultation fees, caps on corporate lobbying. When you combine this bottom up approach with a more top down approach, you can see that there is a reform agenda for reinventing the role businesses play in our system of capitalism, and which potentially might also offer an antidote to the current politicization of the business space. I heard that the US Chamber of Commerce might soon get a sister organization in order to act in a less woke manner. So we are really going quite far in fragmenting possibly the only or the ultimate part of what is bringing together American society, right? Capitalism. And this is what scares me the most as an observer and somebody who is not a US resident today.
And on that note, I just want to also share that at ClimateVoice, we created a trade association explainer for people to get a basics on what we're talking about. Sometimes it feels very technical, a little bit abstract. So check that out on our website. We'll pin it here as well. Andrea, back to you.
Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you very much, Alberto. And I'd say the key is to get all of that fabulous reform passed. But I chip in that it's also important to vote as well as lobby. So with that, I just would like to open it up. I'd like to acknowledge Amy Meyer, who joined us. Welcome, Amy. Jérôme, welcome. I love the name Preventable surprises. This is, as I understand it, an influence tank to prevent or mitigate corporate or market implosions impacting society at large. And that could range from climate, health, or exacerbating social inequalities and more. So tell us a bit more about your work and how Preventable Surprises goes about doing this.
Thanks for having me. Preventable surprises is well, you've described it much better than I than I could. Uh, we have our roots in responsible finance and in what's now called ESG, for better or worse. And we've always looked at how financial markets and the big money managers influence and power intersects with large systemic issues like climate change, like human rights, and so on and so forth. We became interested in lobbying and policy capture when we saw that many of the investors that had developed somewhat comprehensive frameworks for ESG, and we can debate whether they were doing anything with them, that's a whole other conversation, but or maybe it's not. But we saw that they were really looking at corporate behavior through a narrow lens because they were not looking at what was happening in the lobbying space. And it was sort of the elephants in the room, right? It's so much about climate, for example, is about policy, is about industrial policy, is about political economy, things that are decided, should be decided by governments. And a lot of companies were interfering with that. And so we're talking to the investors who themselves are looking at the companies and telling them, you're just looking with, half a lens at what's happening there. And so we spent a few months scoring different sectors, doing investor education, showing how lobbying was taking place and what influence it had in different sectors in different countries, from transportation to oil and gas to big tech to banking to healthcare. The possibilities are endless and we haven't exhausted them. And then we published a scorecard. And so that's in May 2021 now. And we published a scorecard where we looked at the world's 50 largest asset managers. And what we're looking for is, I guess, a level of consistency in their behavior on lobbying related questions. That could be, for example, looking at their proxy voting. Did they support AGM resolutions that were focused on lobbying, on political spending, for example, in the US? There's many very, very solid activist groups on these issues. We try to see if they had any policy statements. We try to see if they had any internal connections between, their sustainability teams and their public advocacy teams and so on and so forth. So we raised a lot of questions in our scorecard of 50 asset managers. There's, one that turned out okay, where we could say, well, they're trying, and 49 who did not. And so that's the state of play, or that was the state of play. There has been overall in responsible finance, I would say, an acceleration of interest, particularly around climate issues. There is a collaborative group called Climate Action 100, which has integrated climate-related lobbying questions in their questions to companies. There is a fascinating group called Influence Map, which has done a lot of deep research. There's a lot of shareholder activism as well. So, there is movement. I think the tension is always, Alberto spoke about this quite eloquently as well. There's a lot of gray spaces. There's a lot of gray spaces in terms of what's corporate power, what is democratic power, what is sovereign power, and how do they interact and intersect. So I'll leave it here, but that's basically in a nutshell the sort of work that we're doing.
Quick follow-up to that, Jérôme, and possibly for Alberto, is have you looked at the role of the media in this? And when you're doing your scorecards, by chance, have you factored in looking at the media in terms of, because it occurred to me that even when you do the scorecard, getting that out publicly to reach all the relevant stakeholders that can influence is critical. And so that also brings up the role of media and social media platforms. And whether incorporated into your work, you've looked at a scorecard on those organizations and how they treat these issues or cover these issues, or the companies that you're looking at, the industries you're looking at.
So There's multiple bits to that question. So our focus is finance. So we've not looked and would not look at media companies, although we could do a focus on the media sector and say, hey, hello Rupert, and and show how that's taken over by political interests as well. Our strategy is more about influencing influencers than about a public discourse. That's by virtue of the scale of our organization. In the media, there is a level of understanding and interest in these questions. For example, the FT has a moral money column or section that's covered these issues regularly. The financial press, which we talk to, has as well. And there's a number of increasingly high-profile voices that speak in public media, on television and USA Today and whatnot, to call out this hypocrisy and to call out, in our case, the role of the financial sector. But that merits its own organization.
Of course, yeah. Yes. Just giving you more work to do, but thank you for clarifying that. But on your website, in the blog or the article called Rubber Meets Road, there it mentions that each crisis reminds us that this responsibility is eminently political, and that it's time for investors to recognize that these are not separate fronts, and they must activate both to push for stronger corporate governance and support for the societal and political transformations that underpin ESG challenges like climate change and income inequalities. So, my question is, can you give us a vision for what this stronger corporate governance looks like, as well as the support for the political transformation? What does that look like from your perspective? And then as a follow-on, I'm curious whether you have younger youth leaders or younger generations and their future aspirations and claim to life on this earth as part of that consideration or governance model.
So let me.
Sorry, that was a big question.
No, but it's good. It's the right question. It's the right question. I just want to make sure that I give a meaningful answer. Our interest in publishing this blog was to say financial choices are societal choices, right? The way money is invested, the way that pension money, that our savings are invested in financial markets, end up de facto determining societal choices. And that's the case typically, in the case of energy technologies, quite obviously. And so what we wanted to say was, let's not pretend that these are separate, because a lot of people just go and say, no, ESG and sustainability is a corporate thing. It's a sort of win-win story. We'll only push for things that advance corporate interests. And our point was to say, look, it's more complicated than that. sorry to break the news, but life is complex. Having said that, there are two ways that we identified in this blog, thanks for pointing it out, that investors can wield this influence through corporate governance means. There's no magic here, and there's no, I think, necessary reinvention, although we can talk about different forms of stakeholder capitalism. But at one point, it's to say that in society, it's a thesis we've long advocated for, is that in the economy, in the agency, in the relationship between investors and investees, there are conflicts of interests, right? Everybody does not want the same thing. And sometimes they're small and sometimes they're big. And there are mechanisms to address these conflicts of interest. That's called the annual general meeting. And investors are in a position to propose resolutions. They're in a position to vote on several things, like today, anything from climate disclosure to human rights assessments, but traditionally simply on approving accounts, approving CEO remuneration, and so on and so forth. There's a lot of space there, and in our view, continually insufficiently used space when it comes to big investors in terms of working out those conflicts of interest. On the policy side of things, I think, what we would say is, well, first of all, go back to this when you have an ESG lens. Once you're starting to take an ESG lens on your investments, in your voting decisions and so on, do take the policy dimensions into account. And second, on your own lobbying as financial institutions, see what the connections are between what you state on the ESG side, on the one hand, and what you do on lobbying on the other hand. How does your own lobbying affect things like income inequalities? To your point, is something that younger generations who can't afford healthcare, can't afford their studies, can't afford housing, probably can't afford their jobs, would have a lot to say. I'll leave it there, but I hope that answers your question.
Thank you. I mean, we could obviously do a whole session on the work of Preventable surprises. So thank you for your contribution and for being with us today. I'd just like to welcome and reintroduce Amy Meyer, who is the Program Manager for Corporate Climate Advocacy at the World Resources Institute. Welcome, Amy. I have a couple of questions for you. Last year, you wrote a blog for WRI, which was entitled The 6 Ways to Prevent Greenwashing and Risks from Trade Associations. And in that article, you stated, ultimately, it is the CEOs who must step up. Companies should not risk being guilty of climate inaction. They must align their trade associations as a matter of urgency. Since you initially wrote that back in September, have you seen any CEOs taking steps forward in this direction and stepping up for federal climate policy?
Thanks, Andrea. Writing that a while ago, this has unfortunately been a year of disappointments, as I describe it, in terms of trade association activity in climate change. And this is a space that I and WI have been working in for years now. And there was a time where we started to see a little movement amongst some of the large US trade associations, things that we would count as small wins, acknowledging the existence of climate change, for example, and the role of humans in driving that. There's been new task forces formed, there's been new staff members hired, and kind of support for things like the Paris Agreement or legislation in Congress around hydrofluorocarbons, which are a strong greenhouse gas. So there was a while there, mainly when former President Trump was in office, where we started to see a little bit of movement from the trade associations. And a lot of this was driven by corporate members who were taking the time to engage and to push for change. Unfortunately, this past year has been a hard year for climate, as I mentioned, and we've seen a lot of reversal in these very small gains that had been happening. The legislation around climate that has been coming forward have been ones that the private sector at large has really had opposition to for a number of reasons that I don't need to get into here, but it's been very clear that the other interests, the non-climate interests of many in the private sector, have taken precedent over the small steps that the trade associations were making on climate policy. So unfortunately, I used to say that we were seeing some gains and had something to show for the companies that were stepping up and trying to make changes, but now I'd say that there's a lot of falling back and a lot of disappointment. That's not to say that companies aren't still trying to act, but one thing I wanted to comment on that Alberto had mentioned earlier in regard to the question of, why do we let trade associations and companies get away with this hypocrisy? I do want to point out that a lot of my job is working with companies who want to change the status quo. And I think it's important to remember that companies are, most of them, if you're looking at the multinational corporations, they are gigantic and they are made of a bunch of different people. And there are many individuals inside companies who do want to have this alignment, to be better on climate change and other sustainability topics that are important to them personally and important to the company. And I think what's really difficult is just the sheer scale and the division of responsibilities, where a lot of the time folks in sustainability departments who are dealing with issues of climate and other environmental, social, and economic concerns, they are not the same people who are engaged in lobbying. They do not sit in the government affairs department. They, from some of my research, they often can't name a single individual in those departments. They don't have personal relationships, not to mention professional relationships. So some of this is just a matter of getting the right people to pay attention and identifying the fact that these misalignments do exist. If you're an oil and gas company, of course, this is a lot of this misalignment will be intentional, but for other companies where climate is not their primary issue, a lot of their activity in trade associations is around other topics such as taxes or trade or intellectual property rights, healthcare reform. These are things that are more important to many companies than the issue of climate. So I think it's important to remember, just from the angle that I work with of working with companies for change, is that this is extremely complex, and there needs to be, in my opinion, a lot of education and resources for companies out there who can then respond to the employees and activist civil society who are pushing for these changes.
Thank you, Amy. And beyond the CEOs, can you comment on the role of boards and shareholders? Does that factor into your work as well?
Absolutely. I think, again, I mentioned that sustainability and government affairs departments are often not coordinating. That coordination has to come from the top down. To make these big changes, you really need the CEO to be bought in, to be leading the charge even. And there's no exception for boards being involved as well. Having that buy-in is critical in order to really move the direction of an organization. We often, find that it's easier when there's shareholder pressure involved, when there's a real push for the leadership in a company to make a change. And nothing speaks more than money when it comes to these companies. So having that pressure coming from shareholders, making the economic argument to the CEO, showing how material it is to their company is critical.
Thank you, Amy. And we hope to see more both CEOs jumping into the ring and both top down and bottom up movement towards stronger climate policy. So thank you. I'm going to turn now to Ellie from Change the Chamber, which works internationally to put pressure on the most influential trade association, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Ellie, welcome. We understand that you have another report in the works. Can you tee it up for us?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here today, first of all, on behalf of Change the Chamber. And yes, we do have a new climate report that should be out published shortly. You can follow our Twitter at Change US Chamber to see updates on it. But essentially, it evaluates the actions of the chamber within the last year and whether they serve as pro climate or anti climate, most of which are the latter. And it focuses on the hypocrisy of the member companies and how, I believe Alberto was talking about this. They put on a face of climate advocacy and they'll say it on the front of their corporations. However, they continue to fund climate obstructors within Congress, and the overall report is essentially just focused on the hypocrisies of all of that. As a note on what Amy said, we within the last couple months sent out a letter to all of the CEOs of the member companies of the chamber, essentially saying either leave the chamber or advocate for pro climate policies. And we got pretty unfavorable responses from the CEOs. But within our work with the sustainability members of these respective companies, we do find that there are a lot of people who care about climate policy and pushing for science based climate policy. However, like she said, these are massive companies and the people don't know each other. There's the people who are responsible for sustainability are not familiar with the people who actively lobby on behalf of these companies and who are responsible for the participation within the chamber. So it's more so about, at this point, how do we create a cohesive voice within these companies that is pro climate, and how do we convince these companies to act on behalf of climate policy and public policy. So yeah, I'm again very excited to be here today and keep an eye out for our chamber report within the next month or so.
Thanks, Ellie. But the risk mitigation departments might end up having a lot of influence on how things play out in the corporate environment as well, as climate transition takes place. But okay, we are now very encouraged. Some good news is we are encouraged by President Biden's recent executive order on solar deployment, and we still have a window of opportunity now before Congress recesses in August to get some meaningful climate legislation passed. So from your perspective, what would you urge all of us, companies, individuals, consumers, in our relationship to companies, employees, to do in this window?
Yeah, so absolutely. We've received a lot of information from our inside sources that there is the opportunity for meaningful climate policy to be passed, which is great news. And this is our window of opportunity. So what I would suggest would mainly be putting pressure on these corporations, which is our one of our main roles that we've taken as a nonprofit organization is to pressure both the CEOs and the sustainability councils and the corporations as a whole. We in the past have done 2 target companies per month and will publish information on them, whether they act pro climate or are climate obstructors, just to make the public aware of the types of actions that these companies are doing, whether that's going to be like banking companies funding the fossil fuels or multinational corporations that don't employ green workforce measures and follow like the SDG goals towards creating a sustainable future. So just continued pressure from the consumer will encourage corporations to make overall changes within both of the way that they lobby and the way that they function within the corporation itself.
Thank you, Ellie. So, everybody, you heard the call to action. Lots to do when we get out of this Twitter space. So, on that note, I would like to pass it back to Jennifer to kind of wrap us up and take us out of our episode today as we reach the top of the hour. So, Jennifer, back to you.
Thanks so much. And on behalf of the whole Climate Voice team, we really want to thank everyone for joining us here today. This is such an important conversation. Thanks, Andrea, for moderating, Alberto for being our featured guest, to Jérôme and Amy and Ellie. Such important insights. Please follow all of us. We have a few more weeks to try to get some federal climate legislation passed in the United States. We are going to be monitoring these companies, holding them accountable. And I hope that everyone leaves with a feeling that your voice really matters, whether it's as a citizen, as an employee. Please raise your climate voice repeatedly and often. We're in a critical historic moment, and thanks again for joining us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Have a great day.